The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sickly yellow glow across the aisles. It was 2 a.m., the deadest part of the night shift at Good Foods, a grocery store that was anything but good. My name's Jack, and I'm stuck here with 2 other souls brave or stupid enough to work this graveyard shift. Sarah, a college student with nerves of steel, and Big Tony, a mountain of a man with a surprisingly soft heart. Tonight, the silence was broken only by the distant hum of refrigerators and the occasional thud of a product falling from a shelf. We were surrounded by towering shelves, stacked high with cans and boxes, each one a potential hiding place for something sinister. I could feel the sweat prickling on my skin despite the chill that clung to the air. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence, barely a whisper. She was staring down aisle 5, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Hear what?" Big Tony grumbled, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the empty aisles. He was busy restocking the dairy section, his massive frame dwarfed by the towering shelves. "I thought I heard something," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, like whispering. Big Tony snorted. "It's probably just the rats," he said. "This place is crawling with them." "Yeah, probably," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Come on, Sarah," I said, forcing a chuckle. "You're letting your imagination run wild." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. She just nodded slowly and went back to restocking the cereal aisle. A sudden gust of wind slammed the back door shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the store, making me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the damn wind. What was that? Sarah exclaimed, her eyes wide with alarm. Just the wind, I said, trying to sound calm. It gets pretty strong around here. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced nervously towards the back of the store, where a set of rickety stairs led down into the basement. The basement. Nobody ever went down there. We all knew the stories, whispered amongst the employees like a forbidden secret. The stories of the old butcher shop that used to be down there, and the butcher who had vanished without a trace. The basement door creaked open slightly, as if beckoning us closer. My gaze lingered on that door, a knot of dread twisting in my gut. The flickering light beneath it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the grimy concrete floor. "You ever been down there?" Big Tony's question was gruff, his eyes fixed on the door as if daring it to move. "Nope," I muttered, shaking my head. "Nobody has, not for years, not since—" My voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah surprised us both. "What if we just took a peek?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just to see what's down there." Big Tony let out a low whistle. "You sure about that, Sarah? Those stories—" She shrugged, a nervous tremor running through her. "Someone's got to face the boogeyman, right?" Her words hung in the air, a challenge masked as a question. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerators. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger as we crept down the creaking wooden stairs. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of untold years, the silence around us thick with anticipation. The single flickering bulb at the bottom of the stairs cast long, distorted shadows on the damp concrete walls, making the descent feel like a journey into the belly of a beast. "Man, this place is creepy," Big Tony muttered, his voice hushed in the oppressive silence. I could only nod, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement unfolded before us, a cavernous space lost in shadow. The butcher shop was shrouded in a semi-darkness, the single bulb doing little to penetrate the oppressive gloom. Rusted hooks hung from the ceiling, their once sharp points dulled with time and neglect, but no less menacing. Below the hooks, the floor was a mosaic of cracked and discoloured tiles, stained with what could only be dried blood. A large walk-in freezer stood at the back, its metal door dented and rusted, a single word scrawled across it in what looked like dried blood. Beef. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run back up the stairs. "This is messed up," Big Tony muttered, his usually jovial face grim. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of rot and decay. I ran a hand along the cold, damp wall, my fingers tracing the outline of what felt like a handprint etched into the grime. But this was no ordinary handprint. It was too large, the fingers splayed at an unnatural angle, as if seared into the brick by a force beyond human comprehension. "What the hell happened here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her usually bright eyes were wide with apprehension, reflecting the faint, sickly glow emanating from the single bulb overhead. Big Tony, his face pale beneath his thick beard, just shook his head, unable to voice the horror that clawed at the edges of our reality. We stood there for a moment, three souls adrift in a sea of darkness, the silence punctuated only by the drip, drip, drip of water from a broken pipe in the corner. I forced myself to move, drawn deeper into the butcher shop's macabre embrace. The floor was a minefield of debris, rusted cleavers, shattered bones that crunched underfoot, and chunks of something that looked suspiciously like dried flesh. This wasn't just a butcher shop. It was a slaughterhouse. My gaze fell on the walk-in freezer. The metal door hung slightly ajar, a black maw that promised only darkness and despair. A cold gust of air, heavy with the stench of decay, seeped out, sending a fresh wave of nausea through me. "Don't even think about it, Jack," Sarah said, her voice tight with apprehension. She knew me too well, but curiosity, like a hungry beast, gnawed at my insides. I had to see what was inside. I had to know what secrets this frozen tomb held. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the heavy door open. The stench that hit me was overwhelming, a putrid mix of rotting meat and something else, something sickly sweet and altogether wrong. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. The flickering bulb did little to illuminate the horrors within. Hooks, dozens of them, hung from the ceiling, each one empty. But the floor was a charnel house. These weren't the neatly butchered cuts of beef or pork I was used to seeing. These were dismembered, twisted, profane, limbs contorted at unnatural angles, some impossibly large, others grotesquely small. Faces frozen in silent screams stared up at me from the macabre buffet. A wave of dizziness washed over me and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The metallic tang of blood, thick and cloying, filled the air, mingling with the stench of decay and something else, something acrid, like burning hair and sulphur. It was the smell of death, but not a death I could comprehend. "Jack, get out of there!" Sarah's voice, sharp with urgency, cut through the haze of horror that had descended upon me. I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But my feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. This wasn't the work of a man. No man could have done this. This was something else, something evil. These weren't animals, these were people. A low groan echoed through the freezer, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver, one that had nothing to do with the frigid temperature, ran down my spine. I could feel eyes on me, watching, studying me from the darkness. I was prey, trapped in a cage of my own morbid curiosity. And then I heard it, a soft, wet chuckle. It came from the back of the freezer, from the deepest shadows where the light couldn't reach. The chuckle grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural laugh that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Panic seized me, cold and sharp. I had to get out, now! As I turned to flee, the freezer door slammed shut with a deafening clang, plunging me into darkness. I hammered on the metal, my screams swallowed by the thick, insulated walls. I was trapped, and then through the darkness I heard a voice. "Welcome," the voice rasped, each word dripping with malice, "to my special kitchen." The metallic clang of the freezer door reverberated through the room, the sound echoing my own fear. Blackness, absolute and suffocating, descended. The stench of rot intensified. A suffocating miasma that clung to my skin, invaded my nostrils, tasted like bile in the back of my throat. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers slipping on the frost-covered metal. Panic swelled in my chest, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Sarah! Tony!" I roared, my voice lost in the suffocating darkness. Then a faint light flickered at the back of the freezer, pushing back the oppressive darkness. It wasn't the harsh glare of a light bulb, but a soft, pulsing glow, like the embers of a dying fire. It cast long, grotesque shadows that danced across the walls, taking on the shape of monstrous creatures and writhing human forms. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the light was emanating from the meat, from the mounds of flesh that littered the floor. And then I saw him. He stood at the back of the freezer, a hulking silhouette backlit by the eerie glow. He wore a blood-soaked apron that hung from his massive frame like a shroud, and a heavy cleaver glinted in his hand, catching the sickly light. A low, guttural sound emanated from him, a sound that was both a growl and a sigh. It seemed to vibrate in my chest, resonating deep within my bones. "Foolish mortals," he rasped, his voice a dry, scraping sound like bones grinding together. "You dare intrude upon my domain?" His words were slow, deliberate, thick with an accent I couldn't quite place. But it was the tone that chilled me to the core, a voice that spoke of ancient evils and unspeakable appetites. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of dread that pressed down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. I tried to speak, to apologize, to plead for my life, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was constricted, my voice a strangled whisper lost in the cavernous space. "You seek answers," the butcher continued, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "You seek to understand the darkness that dwells within these walls." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that echoed through the freezer. "Then look around you, mortal, and despair." My gaze darted around the freezer, taking in the full horror of my surroundings. The once innocuous mounds of meat now appeared grotesque, monstrous. I could see faces contorted in silent screams, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes staring accusingly from beneath layers of glistening fat. The butcher took a step closer, the floor groaning beneath his weight. The cleaver in his hand glinted under the eerie green glow, its edge reflecting the gruesome tableau around us. It wasn't a butcher's cleaver, not anymore. It was a tool of something else, something ancient and evil. The smell was overwhelming now, a sickening blend of rot, blood, and something else, something acrid and metallic like the smell of burning flesh. It clung to the back of my throat, choking me, forcing me to breathe through my mouth, each inhale a fresh wave of nausea. He was toying with me, savoring my fear. And as I stared at the hulking figure before me, at the cleaver dripping with some unknown ichor, a single terrifying thought pierced the fog of my terror. I wasn't going to die quickly. "You see, boy," the butcher rasped, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, "this town has a hunger, an insatiable hunger. They come to me seeking to sate their appetites, to indulge in their darkest desires. His words were like venom seeping into my mind, poisoning my thoughts. But I was paralyzed, frozen in place by a fear so profound it transcended the physical. He let out a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. Fools. Their flesh, their bones, their very souls. They all belong to me now. The cleaver flashed in the sickly green light, a silver arc against the darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable. But the blow never came. Instead, I heard a sickening thud, followed by a gurgling scream, a scream that was cut short, ending in a wet gasp. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding against my ribs like a wild animal trying to escape its cage. The butcher stood frozen, the cleaver raised above his head. But it wasn't me he was looking at. Sarah stood in the open doorway, her face pale but determined. In her hands she held a fire axe, its blade buried deep in the back of a shadowy figure that had been concealed behind a stack of meat. The figure slumped to the ground, revealing a grotesque, inhuman creature with razor-sharp claws and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. "What the—" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Don't just stand there, you idiot!" Sarah shouted, her voice shaking but firm. "Help me with this thing!" The butcher roared in anger, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. He turned towards Sarah, his massive form blocking the doorway, the cleaver raised high. But before he could strike, another figure lunged from the shadows. Big Tony, his face a mask of rage, slammed into the butcher with the force of a runaway train. The impact sent both of them crashing to the ground, the cleaver clattering across the floor, skidding to a stop at my feet. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse with exertion. "The axe!" I scrambled toward the fallen axe, my fingers closing around the cold, rough handle. It was heavier than I expected, the wood slick with grime and something else, something warm and sticky. I didn't want to know what it was. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the fear that threatened to consume me. I hefted the axe, feeling its weight in my hands, a strange sense of power coursing through me. This was it, fight or die. The butcher roared again, the sound primal, filled with rage and pain. He flung Big Tony aside like a rag doll, sending him crashing into a shelf with a sickening crunch. Tony lay still, his massive frame unnaturally twisted. I couldn't hesitate. I wouldn't. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I charged forward, the axe held high above my head. The butcher turned, his eyes glowing red in the dim light, fixed on me. For a moment our gazes locked, and I saw a flicker of something in those depths, something ancient and cruel, something that saw me not as a threat but as a plaything. And then, with a roar that ripped from my throat, I brought the axe down on the butcher's arm. The sound of metal biting into flesh, the sickening crunch of bone, echoed through the freezer. The butcher screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pain and rage that was abruptly cut short. He stumbled back, clutching his severed arm, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Let's go!" Sarah screamed, pulling me towards the open doorway. I didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled out of the freezer, past the fallen form of the creature Sarah had killed, past the still twitching body of Big Tony. The butcher's screams followed us up the stairs, echoing through the empty store, a chilling soundtrack to our escape. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air stinging our lungs, the distant city lights a beacon of normalcy in the face of the horrors we had witnessed. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the parking lot, we looked back at the grocery store, its familiar facade now sinister and foreboding. We knew deep down that we would never be the same. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. And in those depths we had seen a hunger that could never be sated. The first tendrils of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, a stark contrast to the sickly yellow glow of the good food sign. We stood there, Sarah and I, shivering in the cold morning air, our clothes stained with blood and grime. The silence was shattered by distant sirens, a perverse comfort, a reminder that the world outside still existed. "They'll never believe us," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the approaching lights. Our story sounded like the ravings of madmen. The first police car screeched to a halt in front of the store, followed closely by another, and then an ambulance uniformed figures poured out, their shadows stretching in the growing light. We told them everything, or at least we tried to. The words stumbled out, disjointed and fragmented. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their skepticism evident. They found Big Tony's body in the freezer, broken and twisted. They found the remains of the creature Sarah had killed, but they didn't find the butcher. And they never would. Some secrets are best left buried, hidden in the shadows. Life, as it always does, went on. The grocery store remained closed, cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent sentinel to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones, fueled by fear and speculation. But the truth, the real truth, remained buried deep, known only to Sarah and me. We tried to move on, to forget. But the memories lingered, etched into our minds like scars on our souls. The stench of rot, the feel of cold metal against our skin, the butcher's voice, a rasping whisper in our nightmares. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory bound us together, a shared trauma that forged an unbreakable bond. We had faced the darkness together, and in a strange way, it had made us stronger. But we both knew deep down that a part of us would forever be trapped in that basement, in the butcher's domain, a chilling reminder of the monsters that lurk beneath the surface of our everyday lives. We had been lucky to escape with our lives, but we would never be the same. The Good Foods grocery store never reopened. It stood there, abandoned and forgotten, a decaying testament to the darkness that lurked beneath its seemingly mundane facade. And somewhere, in the shadows, in the spaces between reality and nightmare, the butcher was waiting. Waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon his domain. Waiting to feed his insatiable hunger. The end.